So students, today I'm going to take up the poem To India, My Native Land. I think we have had a good amount of discussion on the context of the poem and the circumstances under which it was written. So today I'm going to actually uh, read some lines from the poem. It's a pretty short poem, and in today's class, the intention is to let's say analyze the poem, right? So in a later class we are going to talk about the literary devices and also the structure of the poem, and of course also the form. But in today's class we will focus mostly on the text. So this lecture is about the sonnet itself, the poem itself. So hopefully by now you have all read the poem, um, and it's a pretty short poem. So if you haven't read it, do read it. Do read it as we start this lecture. So the first four lines of the poem go somewhat like this: My country, in thy days of glory past, a beauteous halo circled around thy brow, and worshipped as a deity thou wast. Where is thy glory? Where the reverence now? So, the first thing that uh, I think is being done in this poem is that the country is being deified, right? So, deification means when you turn something or someone into a god, right? So, you lift the status of someone to the status of a god. So, that is what deification means. And Derozio does use the word deity, right? So, deity is uh, a word which stands for uh, someone or something that has reached the status or has been given the status of a god by people, right? So gods and goddesses in many cultures are referred to as deities. So you can see that at the very beginning of this poem, Derozio deifies, right? So his country has been lifted to the status of a god or a goddess, perhaps. So we are not going to talk about the gender of his country yet because he does not yet imply, but we are going to have a look at that later. So the very first words of his poem are my country, and then there's an exclamation mark, right? So it is as if he begins the poem with a sigh. And then he goes on to speak about the glorious past which he believes his country had, right? In thy days of glory past, a beauteous halo circled around thy brow. So I would assume you already know what the meaning of the word halo is, but for those of you who don't, halo is a kind of an aura, right? So you will see in a lot of pictures of gods and goddesses across different cultures, not just in Indian culture, but we have similar images coming from the Abrahamic religions as well. So we have similar images coming from actually almost all cultures across the world, right? So when there are angels and gods, and you'll find this aura circling them. There's this bright, beautiful, bright light that encircles their bodies, right? So that is the halo. And Derozio says that my country in the past days had this beauteous halo circled around thy brow, right? And that his country was worshipped as a deity, right? And then he goes on to ask, where is thy glory? Where the reverence now? So, as you can surely see, the tone of the poem is, as it starts at least, the tone of the poem is not very optimistic. He is clearly addressing the country. Um he is obviously not talking to people here. He is talking to the abstraction that a country is, right? And how do you define a country? These some of these things we have already discussed. We have discussed the fact that India for a long time was not referred to a country, and Derozio is one of the first people to have addressed India as a country. So that is very significant, but it is also an important question as to what we mean when we call something a country. Do we only refer to the perimeter? Do we refer to the borders? Do we refer to the geographical boundaries of a country. So these are all discussions we will have, but for today's lecture, suffice it to say that Derozio is addressing this abstraction of a country, right? And the first stanza begins saying that this country had a glorious past and was worshipped like a god, but that glory is lost. Hence, where is thy glory? Where the reverence now? Reverence is, I would again expect you to know the meaning of the word reverence. Reverence refers to honor or respect that he believes his country had in the past, in its glorious past, which has probably gone away at the time of his writing the poem. So that is pretty much the first stanza. So what you need to emphasize on here is that Derozio looks back to ancient history when India is believed to be glorious in every field, in the sciences, in the arts, and even in architecture. So these are some of the things you must have read in your history books in school, because you have certainly read about the contribution of ancient Indians in science from the invention, from the discovery, not invention, of the atom to the invention of zero, right? And in the arts, we have excellent poetry, excellent tragedies being written by many Indian artists, and also in the field of architecture and sculpture, we have excellent examples from ancient India, right? So Derozio, as you can see, is well aware of the achievements of the people of this region, which he calls a country, right? And that is what he wants to emphasize here. So he is referring to the period where India was well known across the world for having an advanced civilization and rich cultural traditions. And that obviously goes without saying, because if you remember, the reason why Christopher Columbus, set out of Spain, Portugal during the Renaissance was in an attempt to find India. But he did not find India. Instead, he reached what he thought was India, but actually turned out to be something which we now call America, right? So you all know the story, hopefully, that Christopher Columbus set out to find India. He did not find India. Instead, he discovered this landmass, which is now known as America. Name is not after Columbus. Name is about someone called Amerigo Vespucci, another sailor during the Renaissance. But that is beside the point. The point is that we have ample evidence that in the past, India did have an advanced civilization and rich cultural tradition. And the country, if you speak of the country as a whole, perhaps it was surely a very rich country in the past. And we know this how? We know this from the fact that Europeans tried to come here, tried to find routes to India. Now, obviously, I already gave you the example of Christopher Columbus, but if you also remember figures like Vasco da Gama, right? And the first colonies in India, if you remember, were not British colonies. It began with the Dutch, then came the Portuguese, there were the French invaders, and finally the British, right? So the British obviously outlasted them all, right? And I think that is ample evidence that in the past this region must have had something which was quite advanced, and it surely had a rich cultural tradition and an incredible amount of wealth which attracted all these travelers and traders and perhaps also invaders, right? So we also know that learned men from all over the world visited India to enrich themselves and also their own cultures. So again, if you go back to the lessons that you have already studied in history in school, if you think of figures such as Fahien, Ibn Battuta, right? Like there are countless names. I'm just naming a few off the top of my head. But the point is, there is ample evidence that what Derozio says here in the starting stanza is absolutely correct. That his country, our country, did indeed have a really glorious past, right? But remember again that Derozio is one of the first people, I'm repeating this quite often, but I believe this is very significant and it requires a repetition, that Derozio is one of the first people who calls this landmass a country. Before that, India was mostly not referred to as a country. It was thought of as more of a continent, the way we speak about Europe, the way we speak about North America, right? You'll hear a lot of people going on trips to Europe. They don't refer to going to specific countries in Europe, right? And similarly, that was the case with India. It was considered a subcontinent. People did not, at least people in India and even outside India, did not think of India as the country which we think it is now, right? So till the 1820s, India was a different political entity. In fact, it was not tightly, stitched together, as today the states have been brought together and the country has been forged out of it. At that time, it was not the case, and Derozio, very significantly, uh, is one of the earliest people to have referred to India as a country, and that is quite significant, right? It has a lot of political potential as well, right? And these are things you will study later in your bachelor's. Perhaps when I teach you Nationalism by Rabindranath Tagore, there you will see how these concepts come together, how countries are forged, and where things go wrong, right? Tagore is a great commentator on the formation of countries and where countries can go wrong, right? So keep that in mind. Those of you who are interested might be willing to read a little bit more about Tagore and his notions of nationalism, country, etc., etc. Right? These are all important figures of the Bengal Renaissance, and hence I believe we should club them together when we discuss such ideas. Right? So you have contemporaries of Derozio such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and a few years later you have Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar, you have Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. These are just figures in Bengal. We have other figures in other parts of India. For example, we have Jyotirao Phule, right? Jyotiba Phule is his wife Savitribai Phule. They are extremely significant figures, and obviously to some extent they're contemporary to each other as well. But for today's class, let us limit ourselves to the text itself, and in reading the text we will obviously be led to some of these figures, and when we are led to them, we will talk about them as well. So when the poet was writing to India, my native land, India was under British rule, and the English or the British East India Company and the British government, they had, as you know, ransacked India for their economic benefits, and how they had ransacked India is a different discussion altogether. That is something I would like you to find out. In what way did the British, let's use the word loot, right? How did they loot India? In what ways? So the condition of India worsened day by day. And at the time of Derozio, the state of affairs in India was so poor that Derozio could not believe that this is the same country which has had such significant contributions, such great cultures, and such a rich heritage, right? All of those traces were removed, right? The traces of this great culture had diminished, that one could not see those traces anymore, right? So I will again take a slight detour because we're talking about the concept of the country, and we are talking about what Derozio felt about his country while he was writing the poem. So some of you may have heard the name of a German philosopher named Hegel, right? And Hegel is he's a very significant philosopher in Western philosophy, and he has also contributed, or rather, there are thinkers in India who have been greatly influenced by Hegel's thought. But very significantly, Hegel once said that India does not have history. India does not have a history, right? But you might wonder, why would someone like Hegel say such a thing? Was he an idiot? Did he not know that this country had a rich history? So you have to remember that by the time Derozio is writing, and Hegel is only say around, they're actually contemporaries. Hegel is Hegel is some 20 to 30 years before Marx. So yes, he was very much during the Romantic period, but he's in Germany. Remember, Hegel is not British. He's in Germany, and Hegel is right after Immanuel Kant. So I'm dropping quite a few names. It may be difficult for you to keep track of them. So I would advise you note these names somewhere, and you at least read up on these characters a little bit, right? And that is going to help you. If not today, it will surely help you in a later semester. And if you continue to study English and if you continue to pursue higher studies, then these are names that you will really need to know about. So nonetheless, the point I was making is that Hegel, a German philosopher, according to his observation, India does not have any history. But Derozio will have none of that. As you can see, he believes that this country did indeed have a really glorious past, right? In thy days of glory past, a beauteous halo circle round thy brow, right? And worshipped as a deity thou wast. You were worshipped as a god or a goddess, right? And where is thy glory? Where is that reverence now? Indeed, where is that reverence now? Because if Hegel says, where is thy glory? Where the reverence now? We know that irrespective of whether there was glory or there had been reverence, we know that now that reverence is gone. And what do I mean by now? I mean the 1820s. I mean the time when Derozio was writing the poem. Hopefully, you are able to follow this complex track of thought, right? If you don't, let me know. I will address it later. So moving on from the first four lines, let's now look at the next stanza, or rather the next four lines. Thy eagle pinion is chained down at last, and grovelling in the lowly dust art thou. Thy minstrel hath no wreath to weave for thee, save the sad story of thy misery, right? So again, there are some obvious metaphors here. It does not require great deal of expertise to see the metaphors used in this poem. So excuse me, in the fifth line, Derozio writes, thy eagle pinion is chained down at last. So it's quite obvious, right? India was, you must have heard the story, or you must have read somewhere that in the olden times, Europeans used to refer to India as the golden eagle, right? They believed that this country has a great deal of wealth, and a great amount of jewelry, a great amount of costly metals such as gold and gold, silver, and even diamonds, right? So these were what Europeans believed, and India was often referred to as the golden eagle, right? These are just things that you must have read about somewhere. So the point is, Derozio, now in continuation of the previous stanza, there is no break actually, right? Because the line of thought or the train of thought does not change. He continues to speak along the same lines as he did in the previous four lines. Thy eagle pinion is chained down at last. So he compares his country to this great eagle. And remember, eagle is one of the mighty birds, right? And what has happened as the result of this eagle pinion being chained down? The result is that the country is groveling in the lowly dust that it is now, right? And what does the word groveling means? Groveling is an act of behaving in a servile or obsequious manner, or to lie or creep in a pose that is not very dignified or elegant, right? So to grovel is to fall at someone's feet, right? So if you are to visualize groveling, visualize it as someone who has lost his or her dignity, who has lost his or her pride, and has fallen at the feet of someone else, has bent the knee, right? So that act is the act of groveling. So that is what Derozio sees India as facing now. His country is groveling in the lowly dust, right? Then he says, thy minstrel hath no wreath to weave, right? So a minstrel, there are many interpretations of this word, but in medieval Europe, a minstrel was an entertainer, right? A minstrel was someone who would be a musician or a juggler, an acrobat, or even a singer. Or if you read the works of Shakespeare, you will find the references to the fool, right? Um, and this minstrel, this great country, right, it does not have wreath, it does not have wreath to weave, right? And you must have heard the phrase laurel wreath. Laurel wreath refers to the award that was given to champions in the Olympic Games in the ancient times, right? So it was a crown made of leaves. So this country, India in this case, has lost that crown. It does not wear any crown anymore. Instead, it is groveling in the lowly dust. Finally, he says, save the sad story of thy misery. So save does not mean save. Save means accept, right? So there is nothing left except the sad story of thy misery. So in the second stanza of the octave, octave is the first eight lines, the poet sees India as an eagle, right? And eagle is like the king of the birds of sorts, right? The monarch of the birds, if you may. In the previous four lines, he had compared it to a deity, to a god or a goddess. And in the second stanza, the comparison is with an eagle. So remember that this poem is filled with metaphors. So Derozio has a lot of metaphors for his country. And one of the things that you need to do while studying this poem is remember or keep a track of what these metaphors are. So in the first stanza, it was the deity. Here, it is the eagle, right? So in the previous stanza, he had referred to India as having a beauteous halo or aura circling around it. And such a shift in comparison from a god to an eagle signifies that the poet is now focusing on the worldly aspects of his country, right? And he does visualize that his country's wings, the eagle's wings, have been, clipped. And as a result, his country is now groveling in the dust, right? And so a lot of people, a lot of scholars like to see this poem as reflecting what British rule has done to India, that this British rule has come and it has destroyed the country. It has clipped the wings of the eagle. It has made the deity grovel in the dust, right? It has taken away the crown that this country wears. And like I said, the minstrel is a singer or a performer, an entertainer in medieval Europe. So it is possible that the minstrel here is the poet himself. He's probably referring to himself, right? And like I explained, he says that the country has no flowers to weave or no garlands to make for the motherland, right? So the octave, it ends in a very melancholy tone, right? It is a sort of an elegy. One of the things that I would like you to do, again, this is homework of sorts, find out what the word elegy means. Elegy is a kind of poem, but I want you to find out what kind of a poem an elegy is. So in this lecture, I will end here from lines 1 to 8 because that covers the octave, and the next 6 lines are the sestet. So these are technical terms, and once we are done discussing the poem itself, discussing the text, we are going to look at the technical aspects as well. We are going to look at what an octave is, what a sestet is. We are also going to try and understand what literary devices have been used. We have already noted that there are quite a few metaphors. If you remember, the poem begins with an exclamation, my country, exclamation mark. So these are the devices that have been used in this poem. We will also study the structure and the form. But for today's class, I will end with the octave.